Hey guys, today we're diving into a part of history your teachers probably skipped, and for good reason. Picture this, a young boy in a golden palace playing with wild animals, whispering prayers in the cold corridors of a crumbling court. His name is Ivan. And before he was the Terrible, he was just a child watching his world burn from behind royal walls. Let's just say, there's a reason this stuff didn't make it into school. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where history travels. Now, let's talk about Ivan IV, the boy who would become the first Tsar of all the Russias. He was crowned in 1547, at just 16 years old, draped in ermine and dreams of a better nation. But by then, the boy was already broken, orphaned by age 8, raised by nobles who poisoned his food, beat him for sport, and turned court life into a battlefield. The young Ivan studied saints and torturers with equal obsession. When he first took the throne, there was hope. He reformed laws, empowered the military, and established a council of nobles that for a moment looked like it might stabilize Russia. But then, Anastasia, his beloved wife, his one anchor to gentleness, her sudden death in 1560 shattered whatever humanity remained in him. Ivan was certain she'd been poisoned, perhaps, by those very same nobles who once raised him like a captive animal. Whether true or not, the damage was done. That year, Ivan's paranoia crystallized into policy. He created the Oprichnina, a personal death squad, cloaked in black, riding black horses, unbound by any law except his own rage. Entire towns were purged, aristocrats impaled, families boiled. In Novgorod, a river froze over with the blood of the innocent. But his most devastating act was intimate. In a fit of fury, he struck his pregnant daughter-in-law, causing a miscarriage. When his son, his heir, intervened, Ivan beat him to death with his own hands. The painting of Ivan cradling his dying son is famous, but it doesn't capture the real horror in that moment. He destroyed not just a child, but a dynasty. Russia would never be the same. And Ivan, he would end his days mumbling to icons, wearing rags haunted by shadows, some real, some imagined. One mad ruler down, 9 to go. Rome's nightmare on the throne. Caligula's descent into madness, blurred divinity, cruelty, and delusion. From one empire's tormentor to another's, we now cross into ancient Rome, where absolute power didn't just corrupt, it derailed sanity itself. If Ivan was a tyrant born from trauma, then Caligula was a spectacle forged from excess obsession and godlike delusion. Born Gaius Julius Caesar, Germanicus Caligula inherited more than just a famous name. He also inherited the adoration of soldiers, the legacy of empire, and a fractured mind. When he became emperor in 37 AD, Rome rejoiced. At first, he was young charming, and promised to restore order after Tiberius's paranoid reign. But that euphoria didn't last. Some historians believe Caligula suffered a serious illness just months into his rule, possibly encephalitis or epilepsy. Whatever it was, the man who recovered was not the man Rome had praised. He declared himself a living god, not metaphorically. He demanded temples, priests, worship. He made senators run beside his chariot like slaves. He forced noble women into prostitution in the palace, and then bragged about it at dinner parties. But the madness reached theatrical heights with Incitatus, his prized horse. Caligula built the animal a marble stable, fed it golden oats, and planned to make it a consul. To him, it was either mockery or divine logic. To Rome, it was terrifying. His cruelty escalated in lockstep with his delusions. Spectacles in the Colosseum weren't enough. He wanted executions slow, painful, and personal. He'd order a man's death, then call it off mid-swing, just to enjoy the panic. He once said, "I wish the Roman people had just one neck, so I could sever it with a single blow." He didn't just terrify the Senate, he humiliated them, forced them to worship his statue, accused them of conspiracies, then executed without trial. His rule became a game, and Rome a playground of pain. And yet, just like Ivan Caligula, was isolated in his own nightmare. His paranoia grew so consuming that he began assassinating those closest to him, including family. Even his beloved sisters weren't safe. But madness, when unchecked, eventually consumes the wielder. In 41 AD, just 4 years into his reign, Caligula was cornered in a corridor by his own guards. Stabbed over 30 times, his body was left to rot unburied, as if Rome itself rejected him. From a Tsar who murdered legacy, to an emperor who mocked the gods, madness wears many crowns. And now it travels west, toward a queen whose sorrow became a prison. The queen who carried death, Joanna of Castile, loved so deeply it broke her mind and Spain's unity. The madness of men often manifests in violence. But in Joanna of Castile, it took the form of sorrow so profound, it unraveled both crown and country. Born in 1479, Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who united Spain, funded Columbus, and forged an empire. From childhood, she was brilliant, fluent in multiple languages, fiercely devout. But she was also volatile. And no one, not her parents, not her husband, understood just how deeply emotions ruled her soul. At age 16, she was married off to Philip of Burgundy, also known as Philip the Handsome. And he was, in fact, handsome. Joanna fell in love quickly, completely, and dangerously. It wasn't political. It was obsession. When he looked elsewhere, as powerful men often did, she raged with jealousy. Screaming fits, self-harm. She was rumored to attack women she suspected of flirting with him. But then, in 1506, Philip died. Suddenly. Some say fever, others whisper poison. For Joanna, it didn't matter. Her world shattered. What happened next has become legend and warning. She refused to bury his body. Instead, she ordered it embalmed and placed in a coffin of silver and glass. And then she began the procession. Over the months that followed, Joanna traveled across Castile with Philip's corpse through rain, snow, and plague. She would open the coffin to kiss his decaying lips. She refused to let nuns near him, fearing they'd seduce his corpse. She wore black, muttered to him, and slept beside the coffin in freezing monasteries. To the court, this was madness. To Joanna, it was loyalty. Her father, King Ferdinand, used the spectacle as proof she was unfit to rule. He declared her insane and locked her in the fortress of Tordesillas. Her son Charles V, the future emperor, did the same years later. Joanna would spend the next 46 years confined. She was Queen of Castile in name, but in reality, a prisoner of her grief. She raged at invisible enemies. She refused to bathe. She barely spoke. Guards whispered of her talking to shadows. Spain, meanwhile, fractured as the crown passed over the grieving mother to her cold, calculating heirs. In a world of bloodthirsty emperors, Joanna's madness seemed quiet, but it reshaped an empire. Grief ruled her heart, and through her it ruled Spain. Now we turn to another Roman emperor, one who brought fire, not just to his city, but to his soul. The king who crowned his horse. Nero turned power into theater, and Rome into a burning stage. Joanna's madness was mournful. Nero's was a performance. When he came to power in 54 AD, at just 16 years old, Nero was Rome's golden boy, handsome, poetic, and beloved. His early rule was guided by philosophers like Seneca and advisors like Burrus. For a moment, it seemed Rome might breathe easily. That moment passed. As Nero gained confidence, his insecurities and ego swelled in equal measure. Unlike Caligula's stormy reign, Nero's descent was slow a mask of reason, cracking inch by inch. At first, he fancied himself a patron of the arts. Then he became obsessed with being the art. He performed plays, sang in public, even forced nobles to attend his hours-long concerts, forbidding them to leave even to give birth or die. He saw himself not as an emperor with artistic talents, but as an artist who happened to rule the world. And that world began to burn. In 64 AD, a fire consumed Rome. It raged for 9 days, destroying entire districts. While the poor died in the streets, Nero was said to have stood atop a tower, singing about the fall of Troy. He later blamed Christians for the fire, perhaps to deflect suspicion, perhaps out of sheer cruelty. What followed was a reign of terror, torture, crucifixions, human torches lighting his garden parties. Like Caligula, Nero adored spectacle. But his madness was theatrical. In a chilling way, he turned executions into stagecraft. Even his closest family wasn't safe. He ordered the death of his mother, Agrippina, his wife Octavia, and countless senators. He walked through palaces lined with blood and mirrors, convinced of his own genius. Then came the horse, or rather, the idea that Roman dignity meant nothing. Although stories of Nero crowning a horse as senator may conflate with Caligula's antics, Nero did appoint men of grotesque incompetence just to mock the Senate. He hollowed out institutions, replaced them with flattery, and danced as the Republic crumbled around him. But empires don't applaud forever. Rebellions flared, armies defected. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Alone, abandoned, and surrounded, Nero fled to a villa. With soldiers at the door, he begged for someone to kill him. No one would. So he plunged a dagger into his own throat, whispering, "What an artist dies in me." From a queen who kissed death to a king who performed it, we now move to a monarch who lived in shadows, but tore his kingdom apart. The puppet who cut his strings. Christian Severus of Denmark spiraled into chaos under his own crown. While Nero's madness was theatrical and explosive, Christian Severus of Denmark's was quiet, erratic, twitching, and terrifying in its unpredictability. He didn't shout from balconies or demand gods kneel. His demons whispered, shook him awake at night, and blurred the boundaries between man and monarch. Born in 1749, Christian was a prince with every privilege and none of the protection. His childhood was joyless, marked by cruel tutors and isolation. By the time he took the throne at just 17, doctors already noted signs of what we'd now recognize as schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder. They described a young man plagued by hallucinations, violent mood swings, and tics that left his court in constant anxiety. He would burst into hysterical laughter in solemn ceremonies, fidget obsessively with his clothes, masturbate compulsively in public. He couldn't focus, couldn't govern, and couldn't be trusted with decisions. So the real power fell into other hands. At first, that was his physician, Johann Struensee, an Enlightenment thinker, who became both the king's caretaker and Denmark's de facto ruler. Struensee implemented progressive reforms, ending torture, modernizing laws, expanding press freedom. But as he grew bolder, so did court resistance. What complicated everything was the Queen Caroline Matilda Christian's British wife. Young, intelligent, and trapped in a loveless, chaotic marriage, she found comfort in Struensee. Their affair was scandalous, dangerous, and possibly loving. They even had a child together, likely not Christian's. But Christian didn't protest. In his confusion, he seemed unaware or uncaring. That fragile triangle shattered in 1772, when the conservative nobility staged a coup. Struensee was arrested, tortured, and executed. Caroline was banished, and Christian, he was left behind, a broken puppet in a palace he no longer recognized. For the next 4 decades, Christian lived in quiet madness. The throne was nominally his, but regents ruled in his name. He wandered the corridors of Frederiksborg Palace like a ghost, sometimes cheerful, sometimes catatonic. He signed papers without reading them. He laughed at nothing. He feared his own reflection. Unlike Nero or Caligula, Christian VII didn't destroy his empire with fire or blood, but his mental collapse allowed others to seize power, rewrite law, and change Denmark forever. Now, from the Palace of Shadows in Copenhagen, our story drifts south to Bavaria, where another lonely king built castles in the sky and lost himself inside them. The fairy tale king in a haunted castle, Ludwig II of Bavaria, escaped into fantasy while his kingdom crumbled. If Christian VII drifted through madness in silence, then Ludwig II of Bavaria made it echo in stone. His mind didn't unravel in rage, but in reverie. Where others saw politics, Ludwig saw poetry. While ministers worried about war, he dreamt of swans, medieval knights, and the music of Wagner. Born in 1845 and crowned at just 18, Ludwig came to power at a time when Germany was uniting and modernizing rapidly. But Ludwig didn't want a modern Germany. He wanted myth. He despised court life, hated politics, and rarely attended meetings. Instead, he disappeared into the mountains of Bavaria, commissioning castle after castle, each more fantastical than the last. The most famous was Neuschwanstein, perched like a dream above the forests. With its soaring towers and echoing halls, it looked less like a fortress and more like something torn from the pages of a storybook. And that was the point. Ludwig wasn't building a kingdom, he was retreating from one. He spent millions in personal and state funds on these dreamscapes, plunging Bavaria into debt. His obsession with composer Richard Wagner bordered on spiritual worship. He funded Wagner's operas lavishly, wrote him pages of florid devotion, and tried to recreate Wagnerian scenes in his private theaters, staging full operas for himself alone. As Ludwig drifted deeper into fantasy, the state grew uneasy. Ministers couldn't find him. He held cabinet meetings at 2 a.m. He would speak to portraits, refuse food for days, and walk alone through candle-lit halls, whispering to the past. Rumors swirled he was mad, reclusive, perhaps even possessed. In 1886, his ministers acted. They declared him insane, based on testimonies from doctors who had never examined him directly. He was arrested and sent to Berg Castle under psychiatric supervision. Days later, he was found dead in Lake Starnberg, alongside his doctor. The official report said drowning, but no water was found in his lungs. To this day, Ludwig's death remains a mystery. Was it suicide murder, or simply the final act of a man who could no longer exist in a world that refused to be beautiful enough? His castles remain. His rule in many ways did not. But Bavaria was forever changed, not by war or conquest, but by a king who chased dreams too far. And as we leave the misty Alps behind, we find ourselves crossing the sea to England, where madness came in the form of a monarch who spoke to trees and tried to hold an empire together as it slipped through his hands. The monarch who spoke to trees. George III's mind unraveled with the empire he tried to hold. Ludwig II built castles to escape reality. George III had no such luxury. As the King of Great Britain and Ireland during one of the most turbulent eras in Western history, he found himself not only losing control of his empire, but also of his mind. Crowned in 1760, George began his reign with sincerity and order. He valued stability, believed in divine duty, and genuinely tried to govern with morality. But across the Atlantic, the colonies stirred. Taxation without representation, uprisings, tea tossed into harbors. The American Revolution broke out, and with it the first great fracture of the British Empire. It wounded George deeply. Unlike some monarchs, he took the loss personally. Not just politically, but psychologically. And perhaps that was the first crack. By the 1780s, something was wrong. George would speak rapidly for hours, unable to stop. His handwriting grew illegible. His pupils dilated. He seemed to hallucinate, once believing he had spoken with angels. He was reported to talk to trees in the garden, convinced they were former statesmen. The court tried to keep it quiet, but madness leaks through palace walls like smoke. The most infamous episode came in 1788. George collapsed into a bout of full-blown mania. He babbled for days, foamed at the mouth, and had to be restrained by force. The government nearly fell into chaos. Parliament began discussing a regency. But just as suddenly as the madness appeared, it seemed to fade. George recovered. For a time. Then it returned. By the early 1800s, George was blind, nearly deaf, and slipping further into a fog of delusions. His beloved daughter died young, and the grief consumed him. He raved about seeing her ghost, spoke in disconnected fragments, and wandered the palace in night clothes. The man once known for order and decency became a prisoner of his own mind. His illness, now believed to have been porphyria, or perhaps bipolar disorder, transformed him into a living symbol of empire in decline. Britain, meanwhile, thundered forward. Napoleon fell, industrialization surged, colonies expanded. But their king sat alone in Windsor Castle, scribbling nonsense, mourning what he could no longer name. In 1811, his son was made official regent. George III lived on for nearly a decade after more ghost than monarch, where Ivan killed his heir and Caligula crowned chaos. George simply disappeared, still breathing, but unreachable. Now, from the palace gardens of Windsor, we return east back to the Romanovs. Another Tsar, another fractured crown. But this time, paranoia wouldn't just stain a family. It would turn the imperial court into a tomb. The Prince of Shadows and Silence. Mustafa Thorthorn of the Ottomans lived in fear and ruled through whispers. Paul, I was undone by the enemies he imagined. Mustafa Thorthorn of the Ottoman Empire never had to imagine them. They were real, and they waited in every corner of the harem, behind every carved screen and velvet curtain. Born in 1591, Mustafa spent most of his youth not as a prince, but as a prisoner. He grew up inside the cafes, or cage, a shadowy wing of the Topkapi Palace, where potential heirs were confined to prevent rival claims to the throne. This system was meant to preserve stability. But for young Mustafa, it was a tomb in all but name. No sunlight, no schooling, no freedom, just whispers, paranoia, and silence. When his brother, Sultan Ahmed, died without an adult heir, the court panicked. With no clear successor, they turned to Mustafa, who had spent over a decade in near total isolation. He was pulled from the cage dressed in royal robes and crowned Sultan in 1617. What followed was one of the most bewildering reigns in Ottoman history. Mustafa refused to speak at court. He would mutter to himself for hours, rock back and forth during official meetings, and stare blankly at courtiers asking for orders. He tore the turbans off his viziers' heads, in public hurled coins from palace balconies at street vendors, and became fixated on fishermen, believing they whispered divine secrets. Ministers made decisions without him. Eunuchs and palace women whispered guidance into his ears. The empire in many ways ran itself despite the Sultan on the throne. After a year of chaos, Mustafa was deposed by court factions. He was returned to the cage where he lapsed deeper into delusion. But history wasn't finished with him. In 1622, his teenage nephew, Osman II, was assassinated by rebellious Janissaries. Desperate for stability, the court reinstalled Mustafa as Sultan. Once again, the silent ghost in royal robes stood atop an empire he could barely understand. His second reign was even more tragic. He paced halls alone, plucking at drapes. He tried to drown his grand vizier. He wept during meetings, unable to recognize his own officials. Finally, after 15 months, he was removed again, this time for good. Mustafa lived out his remaining years back in the cage, a ruler twice crowned, twice broken, and utterly forgotten by the state he had once been forced to lead. His story is quiet. No massacres, no wars, no grand speeches. Just the slow, suffocating damage that power does to those never meant to hold it. And now we arrive at the final figure, a Chinese emperor who ruled not with law or ritual, but through fantasy so absurd it brought his dynasty to the edge of collapse. The madman who ruled the dead emperor, Zhu Hozhao of China, turned rule into delusion and a nation into a playground. If Mustafa I ruled through absence, then Zhu Hozhao of the Ming dynasty ruled through imagination. Not wisdom, not policy, just wild, untethered delusion. Born in 1491, Zhu Hozhao became emperor at the age of 14. Intelligent, quick-witted, and thoroughly bored by the trappings of bureaucracy, he took the throne with all the enthusiasm of a teenager being forced into a desk job. He had no interest in governance. He wanted entertainment, excitement, escape. And what he created was a living fantasy. Rather than live in the Forbidden City, he built a massive pleasure palace called the Leopard House. There he kept exotic animals, staged wrestling matches, and surrounded himself with dwarfs, actors, magicians, and hundreds of women dressed in theatrical costumes. He would ride through the streets of Beijing in disguise, declaring himself a general or a merchant, forcing citizens to play along. He gave himself fake names and played fake wars. At one point, he declared himself Zhu Shu, a made-up military officer, and staged a campaign against non-existent rebels, commanding actual soldiers, issuing real orders, and punishing dissenters who didn't pretend convincingly enough. He abandoned state rituals, ignored petitions, and made eunuchs his mouthpieces, handing them extraordinary power, while scholar officials fumed. The Confucian elite, bound to tradition, watched in horror as their emperor turned the empire into a stage set. But the madness darkened over time. Zhu Hozhao became increasingly obsessed with alchemy and immortality, trusting shamans over scholars. He held seances in the palace, claiming to speak to the dead. He had rooms painted entirely black to trap spirits. He stopped attending court altogether, claiming that governing disrupted his connection to celestial forces. Then came the tiger incident. While on one of his fantastical outings, the emperor tried to personally capture a tiger, perhaps to impress a concubine, or perhaps just to prove his own legend. He was mauled and seriously injured. Infected and weakened, he never fully recovered. By 31, he was dead childless, directionless, and having left the Ming bureaucracy in chaos. What he ruled over in the end was a shell, a government paralyzed by whim, a court hollowed by games, and a nation teetering on unrest. Zhu Hozhao didn't kill sons like Ivan, or burn cities like Nero. He didn't talk to trees or disappear into castles. But he blurred the line between emperor and actor so completely that even history struggles to tell where the show ended and the collapse began. And so, we close our list with one last question, echoing through centuries: when madness wears a crown, who really rules? Final reflection. When madness wears a crown, history rarely forgets. Across 10 rulers and 10 shattered thrones, one pattern emerges. Power doesn't just reveal character, it warps it. These monarchs were not born monsters. Some were born brilliant, some were traumatized, some were deeply human in their longing for love, respect, or meaning. But the moment the crown touched their heads, the machinery of absolute rule, unchecked, unchallenged, magnified their flaws into legacies of chaos. Ivan IV began with reform, then fell into blood and guilt. Caligula danced into tyranny through divine delusion. Joanna clung to a coffin, and in doing so, lost her empire. Nero made art from fire. Christian VII slipped into madness, while Denmark was quietly remade in his name. Ludwig II escaped into fairy tales, while George III was slowly devoured by grief and illness. Portland weaponized fear until it turned inward. Mustafa Naheim became a puppet twice, overruling in name, dying in shadow. And Zhu Hozhao, he ruled as if the empire was a stage, and everyone else was stuck in the wrong script. But these were not just private tragedies. They were national ones. Each ruler left behind awake civil wars, broken dynasties, weakened institutions. Their madness wasn't just personal, it was political. It shaped borders, toppled governments, and cost countless lives. What's most haunting is how often these figures were protected by their own crowns. In any other life, they might have been quietly cared for, guided or corrected. But as monarchs, their delusions became law. Their dreams, however strange, became policy, and their nightmares bled into reality. Even centuries later, we still tell their stories, not just to gawk at their madness, but to remind ourselves power without limits has a cost. It always has. So next time someone says it's good to be king, you might want to point them here and ask for how long. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey through history's darkest corridors, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know which ruler shocked you the most, or if there's another mad monarch I missed. End of script. Enjoy the rest of your day.